Thank you for joining the LSC online webinar series. Today we'll be having host Jeff Schinske and Sarah Eddy as our presenter. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for everyone for joining us. And my name is Jeff Schinske. I'm a biology faculty member at Foothill College, which is a community college in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm really excited to be facilitating this session with us all. I think that there was an intro slide up that said to use that Q&A function. So you might want to actually just click that. It's usually at the bottom of the Zoom sort of window there. If you click that Q&A button down there, you should get a window where you can input questions. And I'll be keeping an eye on those because I have a few questions to start us off, I think, if we need that. But then I also want to, as quickly as possible, get to people's questions about this paper. So you might want to go ahead and click the Q&A button there and begin thinking of some things you might want to type in there for some questions. The sort of general goal of this webinar series through LSE is to be sort of a virtual journal club and provide kind of a behind-the-scenes view into what's going on with education studies with an author, in this case, Sarah Eddy. And so that's kind of what we hope to accomplish here. And we'll take probably about 25-35 minutes just to answer some questions and get introduced to the study. And then we'll have some time to sort of think about the future implications of this work and kind of how this might impact teaching and or research going forward. And then some quick assessments for you to provide some feedback at the end as well. So that will be kind of our goals. So it's my pleasure then to introduce Sarah Eddy, who's a fabulous colleague of mine and whose work I've admired for a very, very long time. So it's always exciting for me to get to chat with her. She's an assistant professor in biology and STEM Transformation Institute at Florida International University. She's also a member of the editorial board of LSE, and so she's in the leadership of this journal's work as well. And her work has not only been featured in places like LSE and academic journals, but also in places like the New York Times, the Atlantic, Science, and Insight into Diversity. So today, of course, we're thinking about looking at a paper about her work around PORTAAL, this observation protocol. And that's one that I got lucky enough to be a monitoring editor on. So I feel like I have another connection to this work as well, which is really fun for me. So I got to see this kind of go through the process of getting published as well. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Sarah and let her say a few words of introduction about the paper and give us some insights into their findings, and then we will kind of go from there. So go ahead, Sarah.
Great. Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining today. I'm excited to be here and to have been invited. And I wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about why we developed this tool and kind of what we see its purpose. If my slides will progress, there we go. And I wanted to start by saying there's two other co-authors on this paper, Dr. Mary Pat Wunderroth and Mercedes Converse. This paper wouldn't have been possible without them. They're obviously not here on this call today, but I do want to recognize the efforts that they put into this paper. All right, so PORTAAL was developed because I needed it, basically. I was embarking on a project with the University of Washington to replicate how active learning was being used in one classroom in 4 or 5 other classrooms at different institution types. And so to do that, I started to realize, well, active learning is an incredibly vague term, right? And so how am I comparing these classes? I need some way to compare them. And so the tool was intended to help measure classroom practices so that I could compare them across instructors. We wanted to capture best practices and really capture whether instructors were aligning with best practices in the literature. And so the other purpose was really to help us promote fidelity to the best practices in the education literature. So there was kind of a personal reason and also this kind of broader reason. So the intended audience here was instructors implementing active learning. So folks who wanted to add active learning to their classrooms or wanted to think a little more about, okay, how am I doing active learning? That was a great audience for this tool. And then also, obviously, the education researchers who are coming behind them and comparing what's going on in classrooms. So there were kind of three goals guiding us in the development of PORTAAL, and the first was that it had to be supported by the literature. So every element in PORTAAL has at least 1 or 2 papers backing it up as a best practice that it does influence different aspects of student learning or other variables we care about in the classroom. It also had to be easy to learn. If a tool is impenetrable, right, no one's going to use it. So we were trying to identify and find elements that were concrete and easy to think about and easy to identify, but also easy to adopt. And then it had to have some measures of validity, right? So we looked at iterator reliability and then initial validity measures for the elements themselves. Right, so the development of PORTAAL looked something like this, and this is really what the paper goes over. We started with a lit review. So basically, I read in the psychology and the education literatures and the learning sciences and identified papers that talked about one specific element that seemed to impact either student learning, the quality of student conversations was another outcome we cared about, and things like self-efficacy and other outcomes that are linked with persistence or overall performance. And like I said, all but one of the elements that we ended up identifying has multiple papers showing that it impacts these things in various settings. Once we had our elements, we had to find some way to organize them, right? 21 is a lot, but it's not so much when they're clustered into 4 dimensions. So by reading the papers, we got a sense of what the authors thought these tools were, or these elements were doing, and we used those to kind of organize. And there seemed to be 4 main dimensions that authors were talking about. So an element might help with practice, so the amount and quality of the in-class practice. They may help students develop higher order thinking skills, and so we had a logic development dimension. And then engagement, right? Without students engaging in active learning is not going to work. And active learning is risky. You're asking students to talk about things they may not fully understand yet, and potentially look dumb in front of their peers, which is something that is intimidating for all of us. None of us want that to happen, right? And so we have to provide some sort of structures to help students engage. And so we captured 2 dimensions for engagement. One is accountability, where you can provide incentives that help students focus on the activities and want to engage. And then apprehension reduction. So what are people doing to reduce fear of the consequences of engaging and maybe getting something wrong, right? Can we make classroom norms, for example, that make students feel more comfortable taking those risks? So from the lit review, we found 21 elements, and we ended up clustering them into these 4 dimensions, right? And then we translated those into observable practices, because PORTAAL is an observation tool. So if you were doing these things, what would it look like in the classroom? What should we be measuring? So we managed that. And then the last thing was really testing the usability of it. So we established that multiple observers could use the tool reasonably and with reasonable reliability. And we've used this tool with observers that were education researchers, that were faculty, and most often, honestly, with undergrads. Undergrads make great observers for this tool. And that's primarily who I've worked with. Some initial findings in this paper are from looking at 25 different introductory biology instructors at the University of Washington, so at a R1 institution. And basically what we say in the paper is that this tool does capture variability, which is great if you want to use it as a predictor in a model. So we find there's considerable variation in implementation of evidence-based practices in introductory biology classrooms. Not surprising, this is true across all disciplines, but it was nice to see that our tool could capture it. And that many of the elements are actually already commonly used, but there are some that appear much more rarely and almost are never seen. So that's a short overview of the tool, and I'll turn it back over to Jeff.
Awesome. Thank you for that sort of overview of what was going on in the paper. And I'll remind folks that as we're going along, you're very much invited to click on your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen there and type in any questions you might have, and I'll try to get to those before my own questions. I, of course, always have lots of things I'm curious about, but I will prioritize your ideas first if you share those with us here. So I think that one of the first things that I'd jotted down that I kind of wanted to think about was to maybe do say a few words to distinguish this from other observation protocols. And so for folks maybe less familiar with the literature or something, there are actually a lot of different ways to look at classes. Some that are they have different purposes. Some more targeted at teaching evaluation, some more targeted at sort of more providing formative feedback or doing research or other things, right? And many of those other observation protocols or ways of evaluating a classroom's activities focus on active learning as well, sort of detecting active learning. So could you say a few words about like how does this portal fit into the jigsaw puzzle of other ways of viewing what's going on in a classroom?
Yeah, so I think it all depends on your purpose. So if you are interested in just documenting how much active learning is going on in a classroom, right, there are lots of tools available for that. One of the simplest and I think one of the most clever is DART, where they just measure the amount of noise in the classroom, and that correlates with how much time students are talking, right? So if you're just looking for how much active learning is someone using, that's a great one. Scopus, which is probably one of the most famous ones right now, is capturing at a little more detailed level, like how are you doing the active learning? Is it small group work, right? Are students working alone? What the basic characters of the active learning. So you're getting a little bit higher level of resolution, right? And then there's the TDOP and the DTOP, and I always mix up which one is which because it's just two letters switching. But they give you a little bit even more resolution. And then I would say PORTAAL is like one place above that. What PORTAAL does is it zooms in on each activity and asks for each activity what elements of best practice are there, right? So during the introduction, are you doing these things? Right? During the discussion, what's happening? And during the debrief, is there a debrief in the first place, right? And if there is, what's present in the debrief? So PORTAAL really focuses on the individual activities, and then you can average across them to get a sense of what's going on in the class. So it's just a higher level of resolution. There's also the RTOP, which has been used a lot. And the RTOP goes one step beyond PORTAAL and is capturing also things that are going on in the planning of the classroom, right? Because what's going on in the class and what you can observe is only actually probably a small part of what the instructor is doing, right? So the RTOP is capturing even more elements that surround that classroom experience. So I would say that's sort of the spectrum as I see it, and I'm not naming all the tools that are out there and in this world, and I apologize for that, but I see it all depending on your purpose and how fine a resolution do you want.
Yeah, thank you. And so I think I probably put a couple misspellings in there, but I actually tried to record a few of those things into the chat window here. So if you're curious what Sarah was just talking about, I put a quick note about DART, and then I put some parentheses for kind of what these things were doing. So DART, based on recordings of classroom noise, what's going on. Scopus, sort of more higher level, higher grain size, what's happening in a course. TDOP, sort of higher resolution, a slightly higher resolution from a Scopus, and then PORTAAL and RTOP, I put in some summaries there too. So if you're curious, you can check out the chat for some of those things we just chatted about there. And then maybe similarly, and then I see some other good questions coming in here, so I'll get to those. But similarly, so you kind of said where this fits into the landscape of other observation tools for what's happening in a classroom. Could you say something about what types of classrooms, if any, this may or may not be appropriate for? So I know that like this was in sort of more of a research type university. I think the smallest class size was like 159 students. So how would this translate to a liberal arts college, very small classroom, or community college, like medium-sized classroom? Or could you say something about the contextual application?
This tool can really only be used in a class where the observer can see and hear all the meaningful interactions. So if you think about, in a very small class, the instructor may sit down and work closely with one student and be imparting knowledge and arguments and all of that there, and the observer may not be able to hear that. So it can't be used in those contexts where there's a lot of one-on-one coaching, so by the instructor. So it's really intended for large classes where the instructor is broadcasting so that everyone can hear the really important ideas. So that's one limitation on Portal for sure. The other one is it really assumes that you have synchronous activities, that all the students and the instructor, right, are doing the same thing at the same time. So if you have stations set up and students are doing different things at different stations, Portal can't capture that variation, right? It's just looking at the average. So it's really assuming that there is one set path that students are kind of walking down and everyone's going down it at the same time. So a lab would not be a great setting for Portal. Discussion sessions might be hard as well, depending on if students are doing different things. Like if this set of students is working on problems and this one's working with the instructor at the board, Portal couldn't capture that.
Interesting.
So it does have a particular context in which it can work. It was developed thinking about introductory biology, but we've used it in intro STEM courses across a range of disciplines, calculus. We've done some intro physics, chemistry. So it does seem to work there. It seems it wasn't uncomfortable doing those observations. The other limitation I would say on Portal is that Mary Pat says she can do it without a video recorder. I can't. I have to have a video that I can go back through. So if Portal may not be what you want to use if you don't want to be recording the classes.
I see. Thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, and I hadn't thought of the idea that we do sometimes have multiple simultaneous things going on in an active learning classroom, like stations or something, or and that would be difficult. Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. So there are a couple of questions that I think relate to, maybe it's a sort of two questions together in a way, but about the clustering or the way that these elements were organized. And so maybe it's sort of a two-part question on that. How did you specifically get from the literature you just talked about to these four clusters, these four categories of active learning? Because I think that piece of the methodology wasn't quite as explicit in the paper. So was there a particular coding technique that was used, or how's that done? And then how did you get the 21 elements organized into those four domains? So sort of on both ends, how did those four domains come together from the literature? And then was there some sort of way that those 21 elements got coded or sorted into those four domains?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think you're going to be a little bit maybe disappointed in my answer for it.
Never.
The four domains came from our impressions from reading the papers of the four areas that people are most talking about. So what are the authors focused on? The majority of the papers focused on, alignment and quality of the practice. We want to have the goal of logic development, and that these are the things that are doing it. So it was really coming from how they were framing up their papers, and those were the most common frames. The mapping of the elements came similarly, sorry. It was what the authors were talking about. So essentially we were reading the papers, and of the four, this was the one we thought the authors were most talking about in that paper. And that's where it went. So what I like about Portal is the dimensions may or may not matter. You could put the individual elements into a predictive model if you wanted. It was really just kind of an organizational framework to help us think about the tool. But each element stands on its own. right? And so we don't have like a sum score. It doesn't really make sense because a lot of these are alternate ways of doing something. So it isn't really intended for you to like some tools where like surveys where you have, you know, this construct and then these are all should be the same, right? If they're in the same construct. It doesn't work like that with PORTAAL. These are just different elements that have been important in the literature that seem to cluster in this way. But you can do your analysis without that clustering.
Absolutely, that's really helpful.
But
and I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, you say like dissatisfying or something, but I don't think that's the case. I think that like it's really valuable to hear like the thought process that people go through in, you know, designing studies like this, and that there's many different avenues to take. And so I think that's really helpful to kind of get under the hood of it and see what's going on. Thanks. So there's a couple of questions sort of about the different ways of using PORTAAL and like, you know, where it might be valuable. But there's one, for example, is, you know, can you give any examples or input on like how this would be used for instructor self-reflection? So like sort of providing feedback to the instructor. How could an instructor, like an individual instructor, use this to change their own teaching or to get analytical about their own teaching?
yeah, so that's actually a lot of the main way we ended up using it in the original study is that I could show instructors where they fell, right? And it was really nice once we had the 25 classes because then you could see where you fell relative to everybody else. And then we also had in the paper our faculty member that they were trying to replicate. And we had that person on the bar chart too, so that they could see where they fell relative to that person. So that comparison can be useful. I think we can also think about, you know, what are the things that you're trying to accomplish in your classroom? Like, what do you want to work on? Do you want to work on accountability? Do you want to work on logic development? In that case, you might look at those dimensions and see, you know, how often am I doing some of these elements? So that would be another way that someone could use the tool. With grad students, I've actually I've made a little checklist out of PORTAAL and just had them reflect on the last time you taught, you know, how much did you use this and just X off, right? And then say, okay, you know, you could work on all these things, but what do you care about, right? And they could use, again, those dimensions to kind of think about, well, I care most about this, or I care most about this, and then say, all right, and within that, oh, I could make sure I make my activities worth points, so students think about using them, or make sure during discussions that I prime the students to remember to explain their logic, right, at the start of the activity. So depending on what they want, they can kind of zoom in and focus on those things.
Yeah, I really like that too. I think that that process of not just implementing the tool itself, but actually using the tool for predictions and reflection, I think that that's a really great sort of tip. I think that, you know, looking at it beforehand and making a prediction of like, you know, to what extent do you think you're doing these things? You know, in my own practice, I find that that's always really impactful because my predictions are always wrong. I mean, like, you know, in one way or another, not good or bad, right? But just like, you know, I think that this is what's happening in my classroom, and actually this other thing is happening in my classroom. And so I think it could be really powerful for an instructor to make some guesses about what's going on in their class, and then, you know, and then look at the data and then do some reflection afterwards. Like I could see that being a really powerful sort of cycle to kind of go through as part of professional development, or as just part of, you know, individual, you know, goals of wanting to improve your teaching. Maybe just on the other end, so that's really an individual reflection that I just want to bring up, that there's people thinking about different ways of using PORTAAL. And so like, that's at the very maybe small scale, small grain size individual reflection end. There's another question, it's a bit longer, but it's about sort of more implementation, I guess, probably more for research or more for maybe institutional data or something. And so it brings up a couple challenges. It says that like, for one thing, you know, maybe it's difficult to get IRB approval to videotape classrooms at some institutions. And so that's one thing that this person is bringing up. And so then they're trying to like get around this instead by having multiple folks sit in and observe. But of course, without the ability to go back and look, then you have people who have to leave to go to the bathroom, you get missing data points, and inter-rater reliability sort of seems to be going down for them. And so so this is sort of, again, on the opposite end of the spectrum of using Portal. Do you have any sort of implementation advice or tips who are trying to do the more large scale, I guess, Portal implementations and getting around some of these barriers?
Yeah. Man, the video thing, I don't know how to get around it. So one of the nice things about taking a less finer grained approach to what you're measuring is that, like Copus, you can do without a video, right? So there are tools that if that happens, maybe if you can't get permission to use videos in class, maybe you kind of take a broader stroke on what's going on in the classroom and use one of these other tools. I've never actually had that problem. We write in the IRB that we focus on the instructor and not individual students, and that we're not actually going to use the words that are being said by individuals. Like those aren't getting written down or aren't part of the study. It's the aggregate, and that has worked for us. So yeah, that's hard, and I'm sorry, I don't know that I have a good answer for you because I haven't run into that.
Yeah, totally. And I think that, we all know that IRBs at different institutions operate quite differently. But I think that was a good tip. I mean, I think it's, it's very, wise of you to say that, hey, there are these other tools out there. And so maybe you do, if you're experiencing these particular difficulties, maybe you do default to something else that maybe can be used more easily without that resource, without that video resource as well. Absolutely. Thanks. So there are a couple about sort of who does the observations and the type of training they have to have. And so I think there's a couple interesting ones about that. One here is not about who's doing it specifically in terms of their role, but their sort of background knowledge. So how important is it for the observer to have content knowledge, like course content knowledge, when they go in to observe for Portal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say for most of Portal, most of what it's useful. It's always useful. But if you don't have it, for most of Portal, you're okay, but they really can't bloom the questions, and blooming is part of Portal, right? But if you don't have content knowledge, your bloom levels are going to be off. So that's where I see content knowledge really coming in. The other place that sometimes content knowledge comes in is if instructors are doing a sequence of questions, how do you know what is really just a continuation of the first question versus a new question if you don't have a little bit of content knowledge? So I've always worked with undergrads, but I've always also worked in intro classes and worked with advanced undergrads who have been through all of those, right? So I think that's a good way to structure it. I think it would, like I said, be hard to bloom.
Yeah.
And sometimes hard to differentiate. Is this the same question just being asked in different wording? Or is this a new question and a new activity if you don't have the content knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can totally see how blooming would be a particularly difficult task for
already a difficult task.
It's already a difficult task for me. Yeah, absolutely. And so another related one, I think, is it reasonable to train freshman level students to be observers, and what would that training look like?
So we have a training manual, and it has activities, and we have training videos. I would say to get access right now to the training videos, you have to write me and I give you a password, because we promised the instructors that we wouldn't just put them out there broadly, but I can share it with anyone who writes me. But be patient. Sometimes I'm slow to respond to emails. So we have a system. I would say it takes about 8 hours total to get students to a point where they've gone through all the training and they're ready to try a class, maybe that you also try, and then you all compare your answers after that. And then you can decide if you think they're there or if they need to do a few more training videos. I think you could use introductory freshman students. I think you're better off using more advanced students if they're accessible. But if you know the limitations, right, and doing quality control and checking, and then you can really tell, you know, as someone who's an expert in this material, I'm seeing these things as different, and so I just need to account for that when I'm using their observations.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I guess in that same sense, like, does it, I'm trying to think of some of the like more logistical pieces of it. Would it, if you're using students, or maybe even faculty, but maybe even more so students, would it be important that those be students who have not taken that instructor before? I'm just wondering about, like, you know, if a student has been in an instructor's class, then maybe they have a connection to that person and they want to see stuff. I mean, there's always this kind of like, you know, oh yeah, of course they do this, so I want to see it. I think that same thing can happen among faculty, and you showed good IRR anyway, right? Inter-rater reliability anyway. But I wonder if that's amplified among students, where there's a sort of motivation to please, or motivation like, I like this person, I was in their class. So do you think that, is that a concern for one thing? And then secondly, like, if that is a concern, then would you need to have students visiting a class with an instructor they had never met before or something?
Yeah, we definitely had students who had had instructors before in our sample. So one of the things that I would say for reliability that we did is like, so we had the same pair of students do all the intro bio courses, right? And then that way we could compare across them and know that any observer biases were the same for all of them. And so when we did it across disciplines, we had a pair of students that did all the chemistry and a pair of students that did all the math. And we weren't comparing, we were just giving the departments a document about their classes. So we weren't comparing across disciplines, just within. And so that stability, I think, is important. And so the nice thing about Portal is that they have to record the time that they see things. So, and then it gets checked by a second person, right? So they're working in pairs, and then they're norming and making sure they align. So you've got two people checking. And also, I may want something to be there, but if I can't tell you the time when I saw it, then, you know, it's not going to end up in the instrument. So I think that helps cut down a little bit of that. But honestly, that's not something I had considered that much. So a good point.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I think that the time, I think that makes it very concrete. It's like, if you have to write down a time, then that makes it difficult to imagine things or or something like that. Yeah, and there's another question about, like, you know, how do raters get trained in this? Do they have to train with you or Mary Pat? And so I just want to reiterate that you said that there are training materials available, and mostly by emailing you, it sounds like, is the best method for that.
Yeah.
So if you email Sarah, then she can get you through the training videos and other resources.
I updated it after I used it at UT Austin across a lot more instructors, and so we updated the tool after that point because we realized there were some shortcomings. So I can give you all the new training manual, the new observation tool, all of that.
Awesome. That'd be great. So another one that just popped up here that I think is maybe is a good sort of branching off from sort of what I was talking about with student sort of considerations, but this one's thinking about, like, sort of faculty feelings about it. So did you run into any difficulties with faculty feeling like they're being graded or fearful of comparisons?
Yeah, definitely. We always asked permission if we could come in, and if they said no, then we asked if we could come in and not video, and most people said yes to that. There's definitely more comfort with not videoing, and then we would go in and use Scopus in that case, so at least there was documentation. Now, you couldn't then compare necessarily across instructors, but the department would have documentation of all their instructors. There were very few people who just were like no across the board. It seemed if you took away the video element, you could pretty much get, well, at least in this instance, I could pretty much get 100% buy-in. And the video, it was really only like 4 or 5 people that didn't end up letting us videotape, especially when we said, you know, nothing that you say is going to end up, you know, let me show you what we're actually measuring, and nothing that, you know, your words are not going to end up in this analysis at all. So I think it depends on your purpose, and it also depends on the trust that's there between whatever group wants to do the recordings and the instructors.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. So let's see, a couple other things. I definitely want to ask one thing more in general, because I know that quite a lot of your work is focused on the areas of more equity and inclusion, and that you're very passionate about those topics. And so I'm just kind of really curious, like, how do you see intersections between those themes, like equity and inclusion in STEM and Portal, since that wasn't necessarily an explicit, I think it's an implicit part of what's going on with Portal, but it wasn't necessarily explicit in the paper. So like, where do you see those connections?
Yeah, so the way that we've been using Portal is to really record what instructors are doing so that it can be replicated. So working with folks who have reduced achievement gaps in their classrooms, what are their classroom practices, right? What can we replicate in other contexts? And I mean, if I just tell you they're doing active learning and they're doing group work 30% of the time, you don't really know what to replicate, right? And so, but if I can tell you that they're always, reminding their students to explain why the right answer is right. They're talking to their students about how mistakes are normal and it's okay and it's part of learning, and you wouldn't be here. Like, why would you be in this class if you knew the answers already, right? And Portal captures elements of that, right? Now, obviously not in that much detail, but we ask about, are they saying things to reduce apprehension, before this activity, yes or no? So Portal also abstracts it out, but at least you're kind of seeing what elements are there, and can think about, someday I would love to do a study on if we find enough classrooms that are reducing achievement gaps, they're using active learning. How do those methods look different in the classrooms with reduced gaps than in the active learning classrooms that aren't reducing the gaps, right? And Portal possibly could capture that and really give us a sense of how those classrooms are different. Now, they may be doing the exact same thing, group work for 30% of the time, but there's something about how they're implementing it, right, that's different. And getting a more fine-grained resolution is going to give us a better chance of capturing that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, I think that's wonderful. That'd be amazing to have that.
Yeah. Someday.
Yeah, I would love that. I could learn a lot from that myself. So a couple of sort of wrap-up questions here, and then we'll get to some steps or whatever that you hope here. But one, I think, is this more general philosophical question about, like, does an instructor need to be at a certain stage in their development or self-reflection to do this, or is this something that you see as a way to get people interested in that sort of self-reflection and sort of having their hearts and minds about the value of this kind of, self-reflection, formative work? Or is there something that you would typically do beforehand to get people to that stage? So, like, at what stage of sort of being invested in this sort of self-reflection do people need to be at in order to use this tool?
That's a great question. And I do think about that. So I think Portal is for folks who is going to be most useful for folks who have already started trying active learning and are now trying to refine it, right? Like, I think when you're first trying things out, it is enough to, do the activities in your classroom and get practice with that, and then worrying about remembering to say this particular thing or this element every time can come later when the cognitive load of just running the classroom is off your shoulders. Mm-hmm. So, if you have people just starting out, I think, again, Copus is a great tool for that, or even Dart. Like, how much are they doing, right? And what roughly are they doing? And then once they're comfortable with the doing, now we can focus really on the implementation. How do you carry this off in the most evidence-based way, right? Yeah. To have the most chance of having an impact. I think that's where Portal or the RTOP or some of those tools can start coming in and be useful. But I do think it can be overwhelming in the beginning to be like, here's these 21 things, right? Keep all of those in mind while you're implementing. And even for folks who want to refine, that's why I like having the 4 dimensions in there, because I can say, there's 4 big areas that this tool focuses on. What's one that you want to focus on, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, now let's look in there. Are there things in there that you think you could do? right? And so they don't even have to take on all of it at once either. You know, none of us can remember more than, you know, 3 or 4 things at a time, especially under stress, right? So focus on 1 or 2 things.
Yeah, absolutely. That seems like a great strategy. And then maybe just building off that, some people asking about, like, you know, how do you, like, what's your more specific strategy about going about providing feedback? So like once you've collected these data, if you're the person sort of now giving that back to an instructor, what type of language or strategies do you use? It sounds like one of them is like, to summarize what you've already said, is that you actually prepare beforehand, right? You have people make some predictions, potentially identify some areas that they want to focus on, and then maybe that really leads into the feedback. But are there any other strategies you have for when it actually comes time to give the data back to the people who are being observed?
Yeah, I actually don't have, other than the other faculty we worked on with research papers who I was in direct contact with, I was actually mostly working with department level people and aggregate data. So it wasn't really talking one-on-one. That's actually an area I would love to develop and get better at. With the folks that I was working one-on-one with, they had a goal that they were trying to accomplish, right? And so I think that invested them and also made them a little more open to hearing the feedback. Like, okay, we didn't, you know, see an increase in grades when you did this. So let's look at what we're doing and see if there's some small things we could tweak to actually make this work better next time, right?
Yeah.
But they came to us invested in either reducing an achievement gap in their classroom or raising student performance overall in their classrooms.
Yeah.
So that is maybe a different type of person, right? Someone who's already invested.
Yeah.
You're doing faculty development work, or especially if a department or a group is kind of bringing this to someone, right? That's a very different situation.
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I can't really answer that question.
Totally. Yeah. And I think, and maybe it goes even back to that there are these different ways to observe what's happening in a classroom as well, that, you know, some are more appropriate for some contexts and some for others, and that this tool may be more appropriate for those folks who have already tried some stuff, are at that stage where they're hungry for the feedback, and where the institutional culture and sort of collegial culture is supportive of that. And I mean, I think that, you know, in all of our institutions, there's probably folks where, you know, the feedback would be better received coming from some folks than others, and at some times than others. Like, you know, there's a timing and there's institutional context at play, and so that there may, this particular tool may not be as ideally suited for certain contexts versus others. And it really is better for those where people have a question, people are hungry for the data, people have tried some stuff, and have a set of colleagues around them who they feel comfortable with doing this kind of work with.
Support and safety.
Exactly. This requires some support and safety. Exactly. And I mean, some of the other tools, maybe it's a little bit less. So I mean, like, you know, Dart or something, you could submit your own audio files in the privacy of your own home, and see like how the classroom noise may correlate with what's going on in your class or something, and then nobody has to see that but you. And so there's, you know, other options for folks who maybe want something that's a little bit more confidential, that maybe doesn't provide quite the grain size and detail of activity that PORTAAL does, but maybe still gets them some answers. And then as we start to kind of begin to wind down some of the questions, and I'll see how many others come in here. We'll try to squeeze in as many as we can. But I guess going forward, what will the process look like for disseminating updates? What are your plans kind of going forward for this tool? I know that a big piece that actually came up repetitively in the paper was like that, you know, as new discoveries are made, you know, this tool will be updated. And so can you say anything about, like, you know, what that process would look like or what your aspirations might be for that?
Yeah, I can talk about my aspirations. So I think this paper came out in 2016. So, you know, I would love every 5 years to kind of pause out on other projects and bring people on board to do some extensive reading and finding, you know, the new elements that are coming out that we want to try to incorporate into the tool, or to have people email me and suggest them. That would be amazing as well. And so that would take a lot of time. And so I'm looking for where that actually can fit in into my life overall. And the other place that I would like to see Portal grow is one of the things we haven't talked about is actually managing the data. And Portal is a little bit cumbersome there. I would love to develop an app that would kind of more seamlessly take what you're observing and get it into the right form in Excel so that you can use it. So that's also on the horizon. We're thinking about writing a grant for something like that. And so, yeah, so really thinking about, well, honestly, it would take a grant. I would have to get a grant to have the time to take that on. And so that is on the horizon and something that we still talk about.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think at one point having an app or something would be pretty nifty, or like.
Yes, I would love that.
Yeah, that'd be very cool. Awesome. Let's see, I'll try to squeeze in as many as I can here. So one question, I think that this is like maybe in some ways a very controversial active learning technique, and so I'm not surprised that it came up a little bit, but like, could you say something about the idea of cold calling? It's like, I think people have very strong reactions to that, is whether that's a productive or non-productive active learning strategy.
Yep. So we included cold call because there were multiple papers that said overall, it actually increases student participation over time. So classrooms where it started with cold call actually found that students were more likely to volunteer in the future. And then the other thing that we talk about with it is that it does reduce the gender gap in participation. So those are the things that we know that it does. Does that counter, right, potential negatives? Well, those negatives weren't necessarily in the literature, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't know about them and you don't see them in your own classroom and you don't want to use them, right? So all of this is like what you're comfortable with. What we were just putting into Portal is what is in the literature. You can pick and choose among it, right, however you want. I mean, the other place, not controversial, but the other place that is really a personal decision is, do you have activities worth course points, or do you have activities for correctness or just for participation?
Right.
And there's some evidence in the literature that if you do it for correctness, that you're going to get more right answers. But there's also evidence in the literature that if you do it for participation, you get more voices. So all through this, your own values have to play out, right? So we're just trying to put together these elements that seem to be leading to good outcomes, but sometimes you have to choose among them.
Yeah.
And we don't know, like, for example, there's starting to be work on cold call and anxiety. And we don't know how that impacts grades or outcomes for students yet. And so I think it's a personal call. And it may be easier in smaller classes and more comfortable than in really large classes, right? So your context matters for that too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate that you say like there's people kind of looking more into this now, and I think that it's one of the many cases in our classrooms where we can also be very highly influenced by a small number of students reacting very strongly to something, and you know, it's the potential for where you know, I have some colleagues in community college looking at this where they were kind of surprised that they saw that the vast majority of students saw no real problem with it, and there were just like, you know, maybe one student per class that was like really kind of got worked up about cold calling, which doesn't mean that we don't care about that one student and want to make it as comfortable as possible. But I think that as always in a class environment, that's why DER is so helpful. It helps us to step back and take that more quantitative approach. Is like, you know, we can be so influenced by that one or two students that is resistant or you know, feels strongly about something. And so it's just something we need to look at more. And then maybe just one other thing that kind of relates to this as well, actually, it's sort of a related topic, is I was a little bit surprised that apprehension reduction was the least common set of strategies used. It seems like to me like a really important set of strategies for doing active learning. And so do you have any reflections on like why that might be, or is there something more complicated or more cognitively advanced or something about doing apprehension reduction strategies for active learning as opposed to some of these other things?
Yeah, well, one, I think it was the point in time when we did the survey. I think there's a lot more awareness of these sorts of things now in the BER community. I also think that we are definitely not capturing all the ways that you could do apprehension reduction in the classroom. We were focused on some of Carol Dweck's work and some of the things that have been published, right? And so, but there's other ways of doing it. And I actually think that that's the weakest dimension in Portal, and personally would recommend that you survey the students about their comfort rather than trying to observe apprehension reduction. I think you're going to get a more realistic perspective, and really there could be practices that work in one classroom and make it work worse maybe in another. So really just asking the students what's going on is probably the best way to get at whether that's happening in your classroom or not, more so than observation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'll just try to get in one of our last questions here that was typed in this last minute or so here, but is kind of asking about like differences that you might have observed already. So like, do you see differences in active learning strategies being applied by full-time versus adjunct, or maybe other things, large class size, small class size, or those kinds of things? Like, what can you tell us anything about any patterns that you've noticed?
Yeah, I'm trying to think back. I don't think that we see differences between instructors and tenure track faculty, for example, unless it's maybe in the direction that instructors are maybe doing a little bit more on average in some disciplines. We see more active learning. Man, I don't want to misspeak, so I'm trying to remember. And also, this may not be my result, so maybe I'm going to say it, but I'm not sure it actually comes from from COPUS, that we see more of it in intro classes than upper division. But that might actually be from a COPUS paper.
Yeah.
What else? We see just individual instructors, like the amount of practice, so the amount of time students are talking in groups ranges largely. A lot of times, if instructors aren't doing a lot of active learning, they also tend to be asking questions to the class that then just get one answer. As instructors, if students are spending more time talking, it's that instructors are turning over control into group work. That's a pattern that we see. And then we have some preliminary data that increased accountability increased engagement either through accountability or apprehension reduction. They were kind of combined. Does lead to higher grades. So that accountability, we haven't published that yet, but that accountability seems like it's finding ways to encourage students to engage seems to be really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not surprising, right?
Awesome. Well, thank you.